People differ in all sorts of ways. Most of our differences generally go unnoticed, though, when we interact. So when I interacted with the store clerk yesterday, I just didn't notice what the hair color was, or the dominant hand is, or how tall she was. But other differences, as the saying goes, make a difference. Historically and into the present, we put great importance on certain differences, things like race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, or preference. So in this video, I want to talk a little bit about what exactly makes people diverse and why the backstory matters. The reality of human diversity owes roughly to 4 factors, and they're not exhaustive, but these are 4 pretty big ones: biology, environment, culture, and individual choice. So let's survey each of these. First, what might be the most controversial one, biology. When we're born, we get half of our genes and chromosomes from our mother and half from our father. These combine in a unique way to get a completely unique and individual you. These genes are essentially the construction plan for how our bodies turn out. How our bodies turn out, of course, also depends on other factors like environment, but our physical traits do have a strong genetic component. It's not just our bodies that owe something to genetics, but even our behavioral traits. A discipline called behavioral genetics has generally shown that everything from how optimistic or pessimistic we are, to whether we gravitate to religion, to how susceptible we are to depression, owes at least something to our genetics. If you're skeptical, think of it this way. Our brains help to determine our behavior, and our genes play a part in developing the physical architecture of our brains. So in that way, it makes sense. Of course, a lot of things go into our behavioral traits, not just genes, but also the rest of the variables we talked about: environment, culture, and choice. So for any particular trait, behavioral geneticists try to suss out how much of that trait is genetic and how much appears not to be. For instance, as of 2021, most scientists put the estimate for the genetic contribution to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, at 74%, or in scientific terminology, ADHD has a 0.74 heritability. To clarify, this probably doesn't mean what it sounds. Journalists are going to be tempted, and they will be wrong, to write headlines like, 74% of ADHD is in your genes. But that's not quite what it means. It means something more like this. What the scientists do is to test a sample of the population. They figure out how many people out of, let's say, 100 have ADHD, and then they look to see if the people with ADHD in that sample share certain genetic markers in common. To say that ADHD is 74% heritable means that out of the people in the population with ADHD, 74% share certain genetic markers. Or you could put it this way. If we look at people in the population and we see those genetic markers, it's 74% likely, based on our studies, that they will have or develop ADHD. The psychologist Scott Barry Kaufman says in his book Ungifted, heritability estimates are about understanding sources of similarities and differences in traits between members of particular populations. The results apply only to the population. The purpose is not to determine how much of any particular individual's trait are due to his or her genes or his or her environment. Now, I mentioned that biology might be the most controversial of the things we talk about so far, and that seems strange, but there's a reason. Frankly, even until recently, science has had a fairly bad track record when it comes to using biology to support or justify things like racism, sexism, or all sorts of hierarchical categories that rank people by worth. The so-called science of eugenics used the biology of the time, this is the 1920s, to rank people into genetically fit or unfit, superior or inferior races of people, and was even used to determine who could or could not come into the country, and even who might be sterilized because we don't want them to have genetically unfit children. Yes, this is history. Scientists are a lot more cautious now and nuanced when they talk about biology, but this is surely why some people are reluctant to talk about biological roots of diversity. Let's move to environment, by which we mean all of a person's physical surroundings. As mentioned, physical and behavioral traits generally have some genetics to them, but they also have environmental aspects. To take an easy one, even identical twins, the only people who share the exact same genetics in common, will often grow to be different heights depending on the nutrition they get, the environment they grow up in, stuff like that. Or the same identical twins may have the genetic markers that would predict ADHD, but environment, everything from your nutrition to the teachers you have to your home environment, plays a significant impact. Next, there is culture, which is the social aspects of your environment. Anthropologist Clifford Geertz calls culture webs of significance spun by networked human beings. What religion people around you follow, what language you speak, the types of things that you and people around you do for fun, how you collectively understand your lives. These are all aspects of culture. And people aren't just members of one culture at a time, but we're members of various cultures based on the social groupings we're a part of. Your fellow church congregants may have one way of acting or understanding the world, where your friends at the skate park have different ways of acting. You might what we call code switch the language you use, speaking one way at home and still another way with coworkers. What you're doing is what we all do, learning to behave differently in different cultural settings. Lastly, there's individual choice. Biology, environment, or even culture are things that we tend to think of as acting on us, but we also act back on them, especially environment and culture. Your culture might influence the religion you're connected to and how you worship, but those are also things that are susceptible to personal choice. Language works the same way. How people around us talk obviously influences how we talk, but language changes precisely because individuals decide at various points to say different things to go against the cultural grain, and thereby individuals shape culture as much as culture shapes individuals. We can choose to change and modify our environments too. I can rearrange the spaces around me to better suit me, or choose to find or even create new spaces. Scientists call this niche construction, creating new niches in our environment to better suit us. As you're probably sensing, and you're right, these four variables, biology, environment, culture, and individual choice, are rarely isolated. They constantly interact with each other, and just about any type of diversity we see around us is influenced by more than one of these. Take a person's religion. Believe it or not, behavioral geneticists claim that a person's religiosity has a genetic component, that certain genes predict, at least to some degree, whether someone will be religious and how religious they might be. Even if so, what religion you choose or not depends on all three other factors too. Where you were born and what religion or religions are dominant around you is both an environmental and a cultural factor that surely influences what religion you'll be a part of. But even with all that, you're still a unique individual and can decide to go against these factors. The last thing to note, and it's a biggie, is that there are really heated cultural disputes over which factors are responsible for which kinds of diversity. Are there, for instance, biological differences between men and women, or are those differences purely because we enculturate boys and girls differently? Is race or gender genetic, or might we call these social constructions? Are homosexuality and bisexuality genetic, the product of individual choice, or something else? The stories we tell about what produces different types of diversity are important because they can influence how we think about diversity and possibly how to address any inequities that it might produce. For instance, cultures have long grappled with how to treat gays, lesbians, bisexual, and trans people, and one piece of that is figuring out whether these things have biological roots or not. Some say that if being gay or trans has a biological origin, we can't or shouldn't treat these, as we often have, as moral weaknesses or choices we should help people choose out of. Others, however, say that telling biological stories about homosexuality or being trans might lay the groundwork for treating them as medical conditions to be cured. Remember, after all, what I said about biology's unfortunate legacy with issues of diversity. Another example. Is race biological, or is it, as we say, socially constructed? Our answer to this is important because if race is something we've socially and culturally constructed, if it has no legitimate basis in biology, the idea is that we can try to unconstruct race or construct it maybe in less harmful ways. Or if it has some biological basis, the fear goes, then we'd have to treat race in a certain way as more real, and we'd have to grapple with the unpleasant thought that the racial differences that have led to ugly racisms might be here to stay. Of course, there's a pretty big difference between the source of diversity and what we make it mean. For instance, it could be true that skin color or other physical features we use to construct racial boxes around are genetic, but that the racial boxes themselves and what we make them mean are not genetic. And it doesn't seem clear that we need to decide whether being gay is genetic or choice to determine whether we should treat gay people with respect or acceptance. We'll talk about all that, though, in another video. Suffice it to say that when we see all the human diversity around us, there are sources of that diversity. There are reasons that diversity exists. The other issue, which we'll talk about in other videos, is what we make diversity mean and why diversity sometimes causes problems in human interaction.